Bob?
Yeah. Hi, John.
Hi. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Okay.
I should say for our podcast listeners that you are John Chait of the New Republic, and I'm Bob Wright.
Yes.
And you wrote this epic New Republic piece on the netroots.
Right.
A few weeks ago now, and my question for you is, have you gotten about as much attention on the blogosphere in those few weeks as a person really needs?
Yeah. I sort of felt for a while they were going to have to create a second internet just to deal with commentary about my piece.
Yeah, a lot of people in various nations were concerned about their servers getting blown, I think.
Yeah.
And you would have had a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah.
You got a certain amount of critical attention from the netroots themselves. I should say you got a little critical attention from me. In fact, the reason we're doing this is that Mickey and I were critiquing the piece, me more critically than Mickey, I guess, and Mickey said, well, you should get John Chait on and debate him.
Right.
And I thought, what a wonderful idea, and you're such an obliging person that you're here.
Well, whenever you're in the position of having Mickey defend you, you know you need a better lawyer.
Yeah, it's pretty much the Alamo when Mickey's the guy on your side, I would say.
Yeah, I don't want to be in the Ann Coulter position, so I decided
I'm afraid it is you, Mickey, and Ann at this point, John.
That's us, huh?
Yeah. Maybe we should start out, just in case there's anybody who's been in a cave for the last few weeks, and for that matter, the last few years, getting clear on what the netroots are, because, for one thing, this was actually, the definition was a subject of some discussion in some of the commentary you drew on TNR's own website, I think, right?
Yes.
How are you defining
I'm holding up the magazine.
What's that? Oh, good.
I'm holding up the cover.
Good.
There it is.
They're going to be so proud of you at that magazine for doing that, John.
This is the last issue of the New Republic. Yeah. There's the cover with it.
Way to go. You're probably done now, right? You want to leave now that you've accomplished that?
That's right. So what else is going on?
So this netroots thing is going on. Are you
Bob?
John, you're there. We had a somebody's phone was out of order, and I'm not going to point any fingers.
I feared something terrible had happened to you.
No, don't worry. But you had. I hope we got in the part where you plugged the New Republic. I'm pretty sure we did. I'm pretty sure you got to hold a copy of it up.
So you mean this magazine right here?
Yeah. Thanks, John. I think they've pretty much gotten the picture.
Right.
So you did this epic piece on the netroots. In the new once every 2 weeks New Republic, and it was long enough to fill a once every 2 week magazine, I would say. It was, but it didn't read long. I gotta say, it had that nice masterly feel.
Thank you.
Before we argue about it, why don't you give us what your current definition of the netroots is?
The netroots I'm defining as an online-based liberal political movement.
Okay. So you can distinguish, although there are things that aren't blogs that are sometimes called part of the netroots, like MoveOn.org. You were talking mainly about blogs in your piece, and you could distinguish. Right. And I think maybe some of this terminology comes from Henry Farrell. The idea that there was, on the one hand, a wonkosphere of bloggers who they may have ideologies. They tend to, and in that regard, they're like kind of op-ed columnists. But they do kind of policy analysis. They're not fundamentally political activists. And then on the other hand, the netroots, these people are more like just political activists and organizers. Their blogs are activism engines, and there tends to be actual community mobilization that they're part of. One question I have is, I assume that there is the right-wing equivalent, but it's not called the netroots, right?
Right. There is a right-wing equivalent of blogs, but, I just didn't write about it, and I don't think it's terribly interesting, because I think they mostly replicate a role that traditional conservative media have already done. They replicate, what the Wall Street Journal editorial page, what the Washington Times, what talk radio already does. So it's just simply bringing the same thing that already existed to a new media and doing the same thing all over again. So I don't think it's that interesting. It's not a new movement, in other words, so I don't think it's...
But you would equate the Wall Street Journal's editorial page to the netroots. I mean, it's a conservative version in the sense that it represents
a movement organ.
What?
It's a movement organ,
okay.
That's right. Yeah.
And some classic examples, of netroots blogs or Daily Kos, MyDD, Atrios. And then kind of in the wonkosphere on the left, you would have Matt Iglesias, Kevin Drum, and so on.
Right.
And you know, one thing that this is kind of a little tangential, but I thought it was interesting. It occurred to me while reading your piece, and before we get into the meat of the argument, I want to ask you what you thought about it. You know, a lot has been said about the factionalism in political discourse these days, and how much more combative it is than it used to be. In a way, that's part of what your piece is about. But I came up with a theory as the one thing that's driving it while reading your piece.
Okay.
You noted that a lot of the netroots bloggers consider themselves outsiders of the game. The way you put it, they are, by their way of thinking, self-made men and women who pull themselves up from obscurity by dint of pure merit. They see the Washington establishment as a kind of clique filled with mediocrities who attended the best schools or know the right people. I guess I won't pause to ask you whether you attended the best schools or know the right people, John. But
yes, I attended the University of Michigan, which is the best school.
Okay, and you don't know any of the right people.
But I know I don't really know anybody
important
outside of the New Republic. No.
No. Okay. Well, I'm not offended by that. So anyway, but it occurred to me that until the internet, it was the case that opinion leaders in the realm of journalism and just media very broadly tended overwhelmingly to all live in Washington or New York. So they got to know each other inevitably. They went to the same press conferences, if not the same cocktail parties. And now with the internet, you have the emergence of centers of power, like some of the blogs we just mentioned, which can in principle be anywhere. And so these people never actually have face-to-face encounters with influential people who disagree with them strongly. I mean, highly influential people, right? What are the chances that they live in the same town as, you know, Instapundit or something?
They don't have face-to-face... Well, I'll let you finish that thought.
Well, that's about it, so go ahead.
Well, they don't have face-to-face encounters, but they have virtual encounters. Although with the yearly Coast Convention, actually, they do have face-to-face encounters.
Right, but that was
mostly
first.
Right. They have a lot of virtual encounters, and I actually think they are more networked and linked than the Washington journalistic community and the sort of traditional MSM. That at least, you know, the Wonkosphere bloggers I know, and at least what I know of the Netroots bloggers is they're very, very tight with each other. They communicate with each other a lot, and I actually think they're more tribal than Washington journalists, who are quite tribal themselves.
And you're not just talking about the Washington Wonkosphere bloggers, right?
No, that's right.
You would include, you know, say Kevin Drum in that network.
I'm not saying everything I just said applies to him, but I'm not just talking about Washington.
No, I just mentioned him because he doesn't live in Washington. He's one of those that I mentioned who does not live in Washington. That's interesting. But they're networked with one another. What they're not forced to do is find themselves in the same room with someone who disagrees with them. And that was true even at Yearly Coast. I mean, that was Coast people who showed up for that.
Right.
I'm just wondering.
Well, there are lots of people outside of Coast who showed up for that.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I stand corrected. But
they're in the same community. I mean, if you're in the same, if you're on the townhouse email list or other email lists or other chat groups, you know, you're in a community together. And you know, I've actually just been I've just sort of joined one of these kind of more informal email groups, so I see what it's like. And you are in a community, and it is quite uncomfortable when one member criticizes another. There's a lot of awkwardness.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot of internal networking that transcends geography, for sure. That's what the Internet's all about.
Right.
But there's something about writing about the ideas of people you disagree with, if that's your only form of interaction with them, that can be conducive to hostility toward them in a way that even talking to them, even in the way we're talking to each other, although it may get a little lively and contentious later if the subject turns to, say, the Iraq War. But still, I find that ideological opponents have a harder time being really mean to each other in even having a phone conversation of the kind that we're having.
Right. That's I agree with that.
But enough celebration of Blogging Heads TV. As for the piece itself, I don't know. Who should go first? Should I do my cartoonish caricature of it, or should you do your actual truthful summary of what your argument was?
Why don't I watch for those comatose or Alaskan viewers or whatever? Arctic viewers what it's about, or at least give them my take of what I think it's about, what I think are the important themes of the piece. What I wanted to do in writing this piece is analyze this new movement and what I thought the big important changes would be, the main ways in which it's changed the political landscape, which I think are a lot. And basically what I think it is the creation of a counterpart to the conservative movement. What I wrote is the most important fact of American political life of the past 3 decades is that there is a conservative movement and there's not a liberal movement. Almost, I may have a word or two wrong, that's very close to what I wrote. There's been this asymmetrical relationship between left and right for that reason, which I think has had all kinds of mostly noxious effects on American political life. And so the netroots is, I want people to understand it not as a technological phenomenon, but just as a real world political phenomenon that just simply happens to take place online. And it's the creation of this counterpart movement. The part that the bloggers didn't like was the part where I talked about what I think are some of the intellectual side effects that aren't always, that may be politically good from my perspective and from their perspective as well, but have a downside, which is I think the application of movement discipline to what should be, or what at least was previously and could be, intellectual spheres, journalism and commentary and other areas like that. Yeah.
I mean, I guess that leads to what I saw as a tension within your article that was unresolved, which is on the one hand, you were clearly distinguishing from the netroots from the wonkosphere, and the netroots from people like you, because although you don't have a blog, you view yourself as being fundamentally on the wonkosphere side of things, and in terms of defining yourself fundamentally kind of as a journalist and so on. On the one hand, you distinguish between the netroots and the wonkosphere in functional terms, right? In other words, you say, look, there's been something missing on the left. Conservatives have long had, on the one hand, just your kind of, free-form pundits who didn't think of themselves as part of a movement, and, miscellaneous journalists, and then you had your movement conservatives and a whole activism engine. Liberals didn't have the same thing. Now they do.
A message machine is the term.
Yeah.
A message machine.
Exactly. And you're saying now liberals do have a message machine. So on the one hand, you're saying, look, it's, makes sense. It's about time. The left could use this. But then you do a critique of the netroots that seems to me premised on the idea that they actually are comparable to the wonkosphere in a way that this functional distinction suggests they're not. In other words, you ultimately, and here I will engage in my kind of cartoonish caricature of what you say at the end, and then you can correct me, but the way it came off to me was, and I got to say, I mean, I thought I saw I sensed a certain undercurrent of hostility toward the netroots throughout, and as you know, your magazine, The New Republic, has been a frequent target of criticism of the netroots. You don't deny that, and you yourself, I suspect, have, but...
Sure, very much.
So I thought I sensed an undercurrent of hostility. In any event, toward the culmination of the article, like in the next to last paragraph, you basically say they are propagandists. Whereas, I mean, the caricature version of your argument is, whereas, I, John Chait, and the noble men and women of the New Republic, and other true journalists out there, let truth be our guide and follow the truth where it leads us. The people in the netroots are mere propagandists. Now, it seems to me, I have actually 2 problems with that argument. But one of them is that you yourself have just said that what their functional purpose is to be a message machine. Well, as we know, message machines are not supposed to be exactly like journalists. Let's not say they should ever say anything that's not true. But absolutely. But it's different, and it doesn't make sense to me that you would hold them to the same standard that you would hold journalists to.
I don't. What you're saying is exactly the point of my article. You think you disagree with me, but you don't.
Oh, I'm so relieved. Go ahead and explain why I don't.
You don't. That's the point. You just articulated the point of my argument. I can't explain why I disagree with it because what you said is sort of the central point. They're different things. They're different roles.
That's half of the tension I saw. But then you do go to level the criticism at them that they are propagandists, and you don't say it like that's to be expected.
Right.
You say like that. This is my criticism of them, right?
I didn't say this is my criticism. It's my description.
Well, certainly I'm not the only person who's gotten this impression, right, John?
Right. Well, no one likes to be called a propagandist, even if they are a propagandist. What I used the word propagandist in, I explained, propaganda isn't always wrong, and it can often be used in behalf of a good cause, like the why we fight, propaganda from World War II, right? I mean, if I was alive then, I would have been happy to have, written or had some role in disseminating that propaganda. Someone needed to do that. It's an important thing. But you have to distinguish between that and someone who was, writing a book about World War II or, being a journalist reporting about World War II.
Well, but the distinction had been made, and Kevin Drum made this point in an analysis of your piece. He basically said, look, if that's all you're saying, you could have said that in less than 8,000 words. I mean, I don't know how many words it was. And again, it didn't read long. It's definitely, a piece well worth reading. But, if that's all you're saying, as Kevin notes, it's not, that is not a path-breaking insight. The distinction had already been made between the netroots and the wonkosphere. You definitely seemed to be leveling a critique at the end.
Right. Hold on. Let me make a couple points. First of all, in your previous segment, you said the crescendo, the conclusion of my piece was this attack on the netroots, and of course, the conclusion of my netroots was the battle is being joined at last, which is not a negative thing. When you say at last, you mean that in a positive way, like at last it's time for lunch, or that means you're hungry, or etc. I think the piece began and ended. The piece began talking about this, what I regard as this horrendous, awful event in modern American life that was in many ways the function of the lack of a liberal movement and a message machine, and then it ended by saying, "At last we have it." You're right. In between, it moved into what you could call a critique. It's interesting, most of the people, some people have said what you and Kevin Drum are saying. Well, it's so obviously true. Why did you belabor the point? Other people are saying it's a lie. I felt for those people, and they said it's a lie and you haven't demonstrated it. So I thought for those people I have to, provide some evidence that this is true. And for people like you, I can't go on at too much length because you'll think I'm just belaboring a tautology. I don't mean to resort to the kind of I'm being attacked on all sides, so I must be right dodge. But there are a lot of people out there who don't think it's just obviously true, so I had to demonstrate the point for them. And mostly the way I did it was by using the words of the prominent bloggers like Coase and Atrios and MyDD, explaining what their role is and how they, approach thought. And, because I think it's something that a lot of people in the netroots and even people in the wonkosphere are not clear about.
Well, I guess I put it this way. Well, first let me ask you, in your, you had this big back and forth on the New Republic, on the New Republic's website involving...
TNR.com.
What's that?
TNR.com.
TNR.com.
Yes.
You never let an opportunity for a plug go...
I personally get no money from these plugs. It's all...
And very little from the New Republic, but that's another complaint.
Right.
Okay, so you say, to refresh the readers, the central point of my article was that the netroots have changed American politics for the better, but they have lost sight of the difference between the role of a journalist or an intellectual on the one hand and the role of an activist or advocate on the other. How have they lost sight of that?
Lost sight of it because in many ways I think they've absorbed the right-wing critique of not just journalists, but kind of the whole... the whole intellectual edifice that, sort of the, I guess I should back up and say, which is there's this progressive idea of having technocrats and reporters and other people who would have an ethos of disinterestedness, and which does not mean that they're always right. or even right most of the time, but sort of that they do their best to pursue their work in a disinterested way, and not with a hidden agenda in mind. And the right, of course, has been attacking this agenda, sort of the neoconservative Irving Kristol attack on the new class. These are all just a bunch of liberals with their own hidden agenda, and essentially the view that it's impossible, that it can't work. I quoted Grover Norquist to that effect. He said he said something to me once about your team and my team, and I said, well, I'm not on a team, and he said, well, you are, you just don't know it, and that's the right's idea, and that's the netroots idea as well. And I quoted them to that effect.
Well, yeah, you quoted Duncan Black, I think specifically, Atrios.
Yeah,
saying
I think
face it, everybody has a bias, nobody's detached.
That's right. I think there's some quotes from Marcos Molitzis to that effect as well.
Well, see, I actually,
and there were others.
I actually agree with them on that, and that's actually the second half of my critique of the piece. But first, let me explore a little this. The distinction. I mean, it does seem to me throughout the piece that you are not only when you bring in the word propaganda, which I think you will have to admit is a pretty loaded word. I mean, look, if you were just making the point that a message machine is different than certain other forms of punditry, although, again, I wonder how clear-cut the distinction really is, you wouldn't have to end the piece, that is in the last or next last paragraph, bringing in the word propagandist to describe what they're doing. That's a choice. It's clearly a value-laden term, and it's clearly considered by pretty much everyone derogatory, right?
But I went on to explain why I don't think it should be viewed as an entirely bad thing. It doesn't mean like I said, it doesn't mean you're wrong, and it doesn't mean you have any kind of base motives. And it doesn't mean that your ends are wrong either.
Well, right. Yeah, I would say you had to come in and say...
If I just threw the term out there and didn't do anything to sort of to modify what I mean, and just sort of rely on the most wild negative connotations people have, you may have a point. But I very clearly and intentionally didn't do that.
Yeah, but it does seem throughout the piece when you're characterizing the way they do things. I mean, I just found myself time and time again. I mean, for example, that they're very interested in the way things are framed and interested in memes. As if it seemed to me that was a kind of critique. Whereas my reaction was, look, these people are political activists. They're like James Carville, and he's just different from me in what he does. I would not, I would not expect somebody to write a long piece breaking the news that James Carville does not provide a balanced presentation of things, But
right. But to you, it's not news. But I think to a lot of people it is, because I think there are a lot of people, in and around the netroots who have a totally different view of what their role is than what I wrote. And their view is essentially that they have the truth. That essentially you've been lied to by the mainstream media with its fecklessness and its Washington cocktail parties and blah, 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 has been lying to you. And now, here finally is the world as it is. You can read liberal blogs in the netroots, and you will see the truth. You'll find, unfettered reality.
I do think, I'd say two things. First of all, part of being a political activist message machine is not saying, yes, I'm a mere propagandist, right? Now, that would be a story. If somebody said James Carville came out today and said he's a propagandist, said he's a mere message machine, that would be news, right? That would be news. So if what you're telling me is they don't say that about themselves, that's, to me, not news.
No, well, people in Spin Alley, they carry little tops, so there's a sort of hidden, there's a not very subtle message that what they're doing is spinning. They're trying to present their side's case. They're being like lawyers for their side.
Right. That's exactly the analogy, except that, unlike lawyers, they don't go to the highest bidder. They really did, honestly, or at least to the extent that the human mind practices honesty, and we'll get into that later, but they did, through normal human thought processes, arrive at an ideology that they think is the best, right? So they're not like guns for hire, and they decided that's what they're going to devote their messaging skills to. And I personally think that's a perfectly noble thing to do.
I agree.
Okay. But aside from that, the analogy is kind of to a lawyer. Their job is to make the best case for their client, for their ideology.
Right,
and I'm
like
not shocked that that's what they do.
They're pro bono lawyers, what they are.
Yeah. Now, but okay. So having said that, I mean, it seems to me. I guess my reaction to your piece would be one of two. Either I would say, look, you're wrong. In other words, I could phrase part of my reaction in two ways. I could say, you're wrong. They're not propagandists. They're much more like you than you realize, John, which I think is the case. Or I could say, you're wrong, John. You are a propagandist. I am a propagandist. Human beings are by nature propagandists. I could put it that way if I want to embrace the terminology. Either way, substantively, the argument is the same. For fun, let's put it the latter way. My argument is that there are distinctions that can be made between the netroots and other blogs, but it's much more of a continuum than you say. And I think we are, you and I and everyone, are by nature in unconscious ways, in ways we don't realize. And that's the other thing. Is like you act as if you're. Well, anyway, I'll say we are unconsciously much closer to being propaganda machines by nature than I think you appreciate, certainly in your own case, right? I mean, you kind of, let's see, you say propaganda should not be confused with intellectual inquiry, which is what you do. Propagandists do not follow their logic wherever it may lead them. They are not interested in originality. And so on. I mean, so you would say you follow your logic wherever it leads you. It leads you. You seem to think you have true detachment.
Well, you could find some examples, right? If my logic led me to want to write an article that said something terrible about a member of my family or even a close friend, no, like I'm probably going to pick another topic. And you could find other examples at the extremes about that, but. Right, yeah, no, well, first of all, your first argument, which strikes me as you're trying to make an evolutionary biology case.
I would say evolutionary psychology. As you know, that's my view of human nature, yes.
Yeah, evolutionary psychology, right. Well, I suppose, if what you're saying is true, I'm suffering from false consciousness, and nothing I say should be taken at any face value, and there's no point in me even trying to debate this with you. But it's almost... I'm sort of being transported back to freshman year philosophy and kind of proving that I exist. I know I can point to things in my work that aren't calculated to have political effects that I desire. In fact, things that I've written knowing pretty well that there's going to have negative impact on the. It's going to have the opposite political effect of what I want, but I do it anyway because I think that's what my role is. And I think there are a lot. I'm not holding myself up. I think that you've probably done that, and most of the people who don't consider themselves to be political activists, who measure themselves by the value of the work output. Right? You measure yourself by the quality, the writing quality, and the intellectual quality of what you write, rather than did I help get this bill passed or this candidate elected.
Well, okay, but first of all, when you talk about following the truth where it leads them, these people did arrive at their ideology somehow, right?
Sure.
And you don't really know how, I think. They would argue that they arrived at it by, doing the best job they could of honest inquiry. But the second is, as you know, there's at least one thing you've written that I would actually point to as an example of the human unconscious propaganda machinery at work, right?
Well, hang on a second. Let me go back to your last point. So let's not talk about the netroots for a second. Let's talk about Rush Limbaugh, Matt Drudge, the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Do you think there's any distinction that can be made between the kind of work that they do and that? Let's not use me. Let's use Mike Kinsley, E.J. Dionne, the New York Times editorial page. Do you think fundamentally they're all the same? Basically, they have different substantive views about politics and policy, but there's you can't make any distinction between one side's commitment to the truth versus the other.
So what you're comparing, to be clear, is people on the right whom you'd call movement conservatives, the equivalent of the netroots, and then people on the left whom you'd consider journalists.
Yeah.
As I said, I think there are distinctions that can be made. I think it's more of a continuum than you let on. And I think...
I think there is a continuum. Sure there is.
And the other thing is, I think it's hard to say from the outside, because I think one of the biggest distinctions, and one of the most morally important distinctions, is how there are people who are consciously spewing propaganda, okay?
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Oh, well, maybe it's strictly speaking speculation in the sense that I can never even be sure that any other human being is conscious. But it just seems likely to me that, there are people who say, well, this'll gin up my right-wing viewers or my left-wing viewers, and actually say that and discussing it with people in the staffers. I'm just speculating. I think there are some people, I think there is such thing as conscious intellectual dishonesty is what I'm saying.
Right.
But I think the main form of intellectual dishonesty in the world, and the most pernicious form, and the kind that we're all subject to sometimes, is unconscious. And we are, I think, designed by natural selection, A, to do it, and B, not to be conscious of it. Because that would really impair an effective presentation of self if we were walking around thinking how biased we are. But I personally think it's a constant struggle for a person to actually approach anything like detachment in approaching any given issue.
So wait, so let's go back. So what do you think about, like the Wall Street Journal editorial page? And a lot of us have spent a lot of our career, talking about their hypocrisy. When President Clinton is president, they will denounce the recess appointment as a threat to the foundations of the republic itself. And when President Bush is in office, they will demand more recess appointments, etc. You could come up with hundreds of examples like that, right?
Yeah.
They have policy goals they want, they believe in genuinely, they think will make the world a better place. But they are willing to kind of say what they need to get to shift their allies and allegiances because they're the voice of a movement that's trying to create real-world results, and they're not terribly interested in intellectual honesty. Do you think that's a fair description of, say, the Wall Street Journal editorial page?
Oh, I think, first of all, they're probably, a number of them are just true believers. I don't think they're necessarily being cynical about it. I mean, I think it's a horrible editorial page that, for various reasons, but I don't know that they're being consciously dishonest. And the thing you cited, which is to say, well, they recognize it when Clinton does it, they don't recognize it when a Republican does it, that's human nature. I mean, look, they've done studies, John, where they study the reactions of two sides at a college football game to the officiating. And it's very clear that people, they have a team they're rooting for, and they are by nature not capable of taking an objective view of the sins committed by the two teams. That's human nature. Now, so my view is that the example you cited of what the Wall Street Journal does, I imagine if you look closely enough at some of your own writings and some of mine, you would find that. And in my experience, the way you find out that the way you realize you're doing that is you kind of write something or say something, and then somebody from an alternative perspective points out that you're doing it. Now, one of the people you mentioned, Mike Kinsley, is unusually good at heading that off by asking himself in advance, what would this look like from the other side? But I think by nature people are propagandists. That by nature it's the very assembly of evidence by their unconscious minds that is biased.
Right. Well, I think I'll answer the question that you don't really want to answer, which is that I think there is a difference between the Rush Limbaughs, the Wall Street Journal editorial pages of the world, and the Michael Kinsleys, the E.J. Dionnes, the New York Times editorial pages of the world. Which is not to say that they do a perfect job of filtering out all their bias. Of course they don't. Of course they fall prey to, they think their side is getting rooked maybe when they're not, and they play up the flaws of the other side and play down theirs a little bit. But they're willing to make concessions, right? They're willing, the liberal side will say, hey, my president did this and it's not right. Or, hey, there's this kind of appearance of scandal on the other side, but I don't really think it's that big of a scandal. Things like that. And the people that I mentioned on the right won't do that. And the people in the netroots are the same way. They won't do that, ever. Ever.
Well,
so
that's not true. I'm sure you can find people in netroots changing their mind, making concessions. Now, they may tend to make them to one another and not to you. What I would say is everyone makes concessions. but they tend to make them toward people who are part of a group that they recognize as like respectable opinion. And I agree with you, the Wall Street Journal has a very narrow definition over whose opinion is worth listening to and possibly making a concession to. And that's a clear difference, and it may apply to the netroots. But I would say you too, John, have a group of, before the Iraq War, and inevitably we were going to get here because my Exhibit A.
So we're
is
done
something
talking
you
about my
wrote.
article. We're going on to Iraq. Okay.
What's that? Well,
So-
it's a good. I mean, first let me say generically,
Yeah.
before the Iraq War.
Right.
Look, I've sat through editorial meetings at the New Republic. I wasn't there during this period of time, but I know damn well that
Right.
when you guys, I'm sure you brought some arguments up before there was complete lockstep consensus, and eventually there was something pretty close to that at the New Republic. But before there was, I'm sure
Well,
that you said,
no.
but so and so argues this, and so argues this, and you generally kind of aired people's views. But, of course, as you know, there are a lot of people, there was no point in even bringing up their name. There was no point in saying, but Michael Moore says this, because he had been defined as beyond your community of serious discussion. And I'd say that's the way people are. Now, you may say, well, we have a broader community of serious discussion. On this particular issue, I'm not so sure you did, but anyway, you may generally have a broader, a more diverse definition, group of people whose opinions you will listen to than the netroots. You may. That's a difference there can be among people, but I'd say that's the only difference. The netroots, they do, I'm sure you can find examples on netroot blogs of somebody changing their tune in response to somebody else, usually who's part of the netroots community.
Right. Okay, so so basically the theme of this whole show is, this is the evolutionary psychology interpretation of my netroots article. We basically, we could have the Marxist, the go through all the various schools of thought out there. So that's
Yeah.
all right. Okay, now at least so it's straight in my mind and in your mind. Okay,
I mean,
so,
evolutionary psychology has the virtue of being true, but aside from that, you're right. It might as well be any other worldview.
okay. All right.
In my,
so is there
in
a
my
question?
opinion. But look, an example. As you know, so you say that it's the netroots that do propaganda, and they use pejorative terms to describe people who disagree with them, and they don't follow truth where it leads them. Well, okay, my Exhibit A. I discussed it with Mickey.
I think, wait, hold on. Everyone uses pejorative terms to describe people that disagree with them. So if you're suggesting that I said that that's a defining quality of the netroots that separates them from anyone else, find that in my article. It's nowhere there.
Well, okay, you spent a lot of time on the way they use terms like wanker, but anyway.
Right. No. What they have in I think there's more examples of this that I could bring in as well. Is certain terms that I think are designed to completely delegitimize any dissent. Wanker is one. Concern troll is another one. So these are terms that kind of get repeated over and over and over again in almost any opinion that's sort of politically incorrect from there can be described in one of these terms to delegitimize.
Okay. Well, let me get to a term that you threw around that you certainly considered a negative
Yes.
term. I mean, in a kind of famous New Republic editorial before the Iraq War, the term is abject pacifism. It's famous because, for one thing, Paul Krugman has probably more than once complained about the New Republic's use of that term in this editorial. And the way you used it was the following. You were talking about people basically like me, moderates, so-called, who had said, look, if we exhaust all other options, okay, then we could do war. But we have not exhausted all other options. This is what we said. And you belittled that view and said that view is no longer tenable. And now we know that the so-called moderate opponents of the war are guilty of abject pacifism. Now,
No. Hold on. Let me describe what my editorial was really saying. I was just talking about the New York Times editorial.
no, actually, John, have you read the editorial lately?
I read it a few months ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would tell you one thing. You make the argument. I've got it here. You make the argument generically. You don't mention the New York Times, and then you say the editorials of the New York Times are a good showcase of the intellectual incoherence of the liberal war critics. You do...
If you'll let me finish what I was saying, I started off, there was an editorial about the New York Times editorial page, which I used as a good proxy for the rest of the sort of moderate anti-war position. But the way the argument you say that I took issue with them is completely incorrect. what I said, what the New York Times editorial page had been saying all along was that there should not be war with Iraq unless X, Y, and Z happens, or Saddam Hussein must fully and completely comply with the weapons inspectors of the United Nations, or there should be war. Then Saddam Hussein did not fully and completely comply with the weapons inspectors. And then they changed their position and said, well, there shouldn't be war anyway, and didn't acknowledge that they changed their position at all, which they had. And this more or less paralleled the entire shift of a whole group of other sort of moderate, anti-war people, which you were apparently in that school, who were saying the same thing. They said, there must be full compliance. Maybe you weren't saying that, but a lot of people were. They're saying there has to be full compliance. Then there wasn't full compliance, and said, well, there shouldn't be war anyway. That's the point I was making. Now, let me get to the point about abject pacifism. It was a terrible phrase. We've had this discussion offline. You simply refuse to believe me when I say that it was just a hastily typed bad description. I was trying to have describe in one or two words rather than one or two sentences people who had claimed to be only against the war under certain conditions, but now we're turning out to be against the war under any conditions.
No, I believe it was hastily typed. And let me say, though, I mean, you do say, before you even mention the New York Times, yet the moderate, respectable opponents of the war, those who claimed they would favor military action if other steps failed, remain unmoved, and the end of the paragraph is, the mask of nuanced criticism has been pulled off the moderate anti-war position, exposing it for the abject pacifism it truly is. You do seem to be applying it to people like me who would make the point that look, the inspectors were still being let into wherever they wanted to go. We could have beefed up the inspection force. But see, I believe that you typed it in kind of hastily. What I kind of doubt is that after typing it in hastily, like an hour later, you went, oh, that's the wrong term, that's the wrong term. I mean, you agree now it's just a factually incorrect term, right? The people you're describing had not opposed every war in history. They were not pacifists. So that's just...
I did. Well, what I did was when I typed it, I thought, that isn't quite right. I'm going to go back and fix it. And I think I went back and I forgot to go back and fix it. I wrote the word thinking that isn't quite right, but I need to get this in, however much time I need to get it in, and I'll go back, and I think I just forgot to do it.
Okay. Well, it just seemed, the reason I mentioned it in talking to Mickey is it seemed to me like an example of exactly what you were attributing to netroots, which is the use of terms, rather than, it didn't seem to reflect the pursuit of truth because it was not true. It seemed to reflect the instrumental use of language to have an intended effect, which was to basically belittle people who disagreed with you on this key point.
Well, no, that's totally wrong. It's only wrong if you think I'm lying to you about everything I'm saying, in which case there's no point in having this conversation. But I'm telling you, I didn't use that word intentionally. I wrote it quickly. I thought, that's not quite right. I want to go back to it. And then I forgot to go back to it. I was not thinking about what it meant. To the extent I was thinking it's not quite right. I wasn't thinking through. So it wasn't an intentional attempt to do that at all whatsoever. So again, your argument has bearing if you think I'm just lying through my teeth about this.
No, you misunderstand my argument. My argument is that all this stuff happens at an unconscious level anyway. So I'm not accusing you of consciously choosing this for that purpose. I'm saying the human brain does this. And is generally unreflective about it.
So maybe the human brain's doing it to you right now, and it's doing it to me right now, and we're both propagandizing and lying, and we don't know what we're saying anyway. I don't really see where this whole line of thought takes you.
Well, I think I would like to see it take people to a point where they were a little more skeptical of their self-certainty, because a lack of skepticism about our self-certainty is really what got us into the Iraq War, and it starts probably wars in general. Is that people are by design not critical about their own motivations. And I'm not saying, you're any worse than any other human being, including me. I'm just saying that's the way we are. And I think, in the netroots, they're human beings too. And if you think they're being consciously cynical, I think I would remain unconvinced. I mean,
what I'm arguing is they have an ideology that derogates the idea of separating yourself from these biases. In other words, you and I say, yes, we have these biases. We need to do the best we can to separate ourselves from them. And sometimes we fail. When we fail, and we should try to recognize it, and we should try to correct it. What they say is, this whole idea that you can separate yourselves is a myth. And so we're not even going to try. We're in a war with the right, and we're going to do what it takes to win. So you don't see the difference between aspiring to recognize your biases as best as you can while often failing and having no aspiration to do that whatsoever?
Oh, I think they aspire to recognize their biases to some extent, and sometimes do.
Well, I don't think they do. I mean, and I think the quotes I put in the article suggesting that they have really contempt for the ethos that you and I are describing. Prove that.
Well, okay.
And I could find many other such quotes. I mean, I just picked a couple, but I could have gone on for a long time.
Okay, but again, I mean, this isn't actually the only part of that editorial you wrote that I think is kind of at odds with the implied description of kind of you and true journalists and people at the New Republic as these really quite detached pursuers of the truth, or fairly detached. I mean, for example...
Hang on. Pursuers of the truth. This is a phrase that a lot of people in the netroots have used to describe my article. And it doesn't appear anywhere in the article. And in fact, the idea doesn't appear in my article. The idea I have in my article is I want to talk about the truth of the world as the way you see it. So people have been trying to set up this straw man. In fact, Ezra Klein did it today. Matthew Iglesias did it today. This has become the straw man.
Are they still talking about it?
Yes, they're still talking about it by implication. Yes.
Excellent.
That's
okay.
today. That is Monday. There's no. I'm not. Most of these things. Most questions of the world are not factual, right? Most questions have levels of opinion. So I'm not saying that there is just the truth out there, and you have to be a journalist to see it, and if you're a blogger you can't see it. What I'm saying is there's the truth about the world as you see it. There's your honest opinion of the world.
Okay.
And there's a difference between trying to render your honest opinion of the world and trying to render the version of your opinion of the world that you think will have the best political effect.
Okay, I'm saying that I think it's all a little kind of blurrier than that, and this particular phrase in your editorial is, I think, not the only example of that. You know, this was right after Hans Blix's report had come out, and you say, some hilariously have described his report as mixed. And then you quote some of the things critically he said of Saddam. It was a harsh report, but it certainly was mixed. I mean, one of the things you don't mention from his report is his noting that Saddam Hussein had complied in the sense of letting the inspectors look wherever they want. That's a very crucial feature of compliance. And in retrospect, you might ask, well, couldn't George Bush have just said to the world which didn't want him to invade, okay, I'll hold off if we'll like quadruple the inspection force and leave them in there for a year? Of course he could have done that. You don't. But you assert that Blix's report is not even mixed when in fact it contained this crucial fact. And I don't think you were being consciously dishonest. I think at some point you decided war is just definitely the right thing. And at that point, in classic human fashion, which I have exhibited myself on occasion, you became less susceptible to contrary evidence than to evidence supporting your view. And this is the kind of thing that got us into the war. Fairly early on, the whole political establishment decided we just should do this war. And at that point, I personally felt like I was living in the Twilight Zone. It was like,
Well, Bob, first of all, even if everything you just said is true, I really don't see how that refutes anything I wrote in my article. Number one. Second of all, I don't think what you wrote is a fair rendering of the editorial anyway.
Well, we can link to it.
But again, and third of all, if I know that so much of this episode would be taken up with a close textual reading of this editorial that I wrote 4 years ago, I would have, it would have been nice to have told me this in advance.
Well, John, we had an email exchange about this very editorial like last week.
Yeah.
I read it before I wrote about it. You knew it was on my mind, right?
Yes, I know. You seem to have it in front of you, right?
I absolutely do.
Right. Well, I could be reading from it. I could be reading from it too if I know that this is what you wanted to.
John, this was at the crux of our email exchange, and you knew that exchange was what this is about. I mean, don't act like there's some breach of etiquette here on my part. Come on.
Well, I do think there's a breach of etiquette. Whatever. I mean, I don't think that's the main point I wanted to make. But if you really want to go on talking about with your closed textual analysis of this editorial, maybe we should pause the segment. I'll go print it out, and we'll both have it in front of us.
Actually, what we could do, this would be great television. We could call it a day, and you could come back a week from now armed.
No. Why don't we just? No, I've got a real job.
Hey, this is real. Except
No, look, the point wasn't, even of the line that you're reading, it wasn't that the report wasn't mixed. It was mixed, but the point was how implausible that was as a defense, when the whole predicate that everyone, at least everyone from the sort of in the moderate position on, was agreeing to, was that there had to be full compliance. Full compliance. This is what the United States said. This is what people associated with the United Nations Security Council said. This is what the New York Times editorial page said, and other liberals of that persuasion said there has to be full compliance. And then there's not full compliance. But what they say is mixed. The big phrase is mixed. Well, mixed means not full compliance. So from that perspective, whether it's 50% or 70% or 0% isn't relevant. That was the point of the editorial.
Well, actually, what the editorial says, in the run-up to calling us abjectly pacifist, is not. Well, I'm sorry, John. You're right. I'm saying we can pause if you want. You can read it, but that's just not. It does not talk about those who said they would insist on full compliance. The phrase is those who claimed they would favor military action if other steps failed. Clearly, not all other steps had failed. We had access to every square inch of turf in Iraq that the inspectors were asking to see.
But we didn't have access to the weapons scientists, which was a crucial fact that Saddam Hussein was denying.
No.
Again, after 12 years of back and forth and coming close to the line and backing away and coming close and coming and backing away, well, we said there's one more chance. We're not going to play any more of this salami slicing, no more of this giving most of what we want or part of what we want. It's all of what we want now or war, period. And everyone agreed to those parameters, and then those parameters weren't met. That was the point of the editorial.
There had not been full compliance, but those of us who had been saying only when all other steps are exhausted certainly had reason to believe, and this is what I think you did not pause to see the plausibility of when writing this. It was a plausible case that, look, so long as we can look, anywhere we want with all the inspectors, an extreme measure of war is just not yet in order. That's not a crazy case. That's not the case of an abject pacifist.
No, of course it's not.
Well, but you said it was. And
we'll
look,
cycle back. Okay, you're right. It was wrong. It was wrong. It was not. You're right. It was not. And if you asked me the next day if it was the case of an abject pessimist, I said, you're right, it's not. I wish I changed that word. I wrote the word. I knew it wasn't quite right. I forgot to go back to it. Mea culpa. But again, let me pull away for a second, because again, the point isn't that I'm always right, or that people who try to describe the world as they see it are always right. No, you can be wrong. A few weeks ago we talked about who's the most honest conservative, and I named Ramesh Ponnuru. Actually, we had a blogging head segment that was scotched for technical reasons. I was asked about this with Eric Ulterman. I said, Ramesh Ponnuru, he's honest. He's not a political hack. He describes the world as he sees it. Now Ramesh and I disagree on almost everything, which is again. So I'm not saying there's a truth, because if there's a truth and Ramesh and I are both pursuing it, we disagree all the time. So that can't be the case. So again, yeah, you're right. I made some arguments. I wrote a word which was a bad word, which was an inaccurate word by mistake, unless you think I'm lying about that. And it's wrong, and I've got all kinds of opinions that tend not to be borne out. I don't see what this has to do with my article.
Oh no, it's just my assertion that that actually, first of all, no, I don't think you're lying about what your conscious state of mind was. My belief that the kind of thing you did there is the kind of thing I've done and the kind of thing that people do all the time, and it's the reason that there is just more of a continuum between the people you're calling propagandists and whoever you're calling not propagandists than is appreciated. And look, I think it would be a better world if we all reflected on it more. Don't get me wrong.
I think there is a continuum. You're right. You're right. But like I said, the crucial difference is that when you tell me that, if you can convince me that I wrote something that was that was inaccurate and wrong,
yeah.
You say you're right. I'm not going to say, well, sorry, my goal was to start a war and I succeeded, so they're there. So yeah, and who's to say it was wrong? There's no such thing as right and wrong.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm saying. That's what. Of course, there's a continuum, but I'm saying there's an important distinction within that continuum you can make. The mentality that's taken hold of the netroots is very, very sharply different than the mentality that sort of predominated in liberal opinion journalism before the rise of the netroots. It's a very different mentality, and that's what I was trying to say.
I guess what maybe is at the source of my frustration is that before the Iraq War, I saw most of the opinion-making class become much more like what you're saying the netroots is now. It became the political establishment, including liberal hawks, which at that point seemed to include a whole lot of liberals, and the right, all together became this kind of, in my mind, increasingly closed off to contrary evidence machine. And there is this term called groupthink about the way people get together and reinforce their views. And
right.
I think that's the reason I focus on this example as something that I would recommend for your own reading, before giving people the impression that I'm not the only one to have gotten from your piece by any means, John, which was that you were that it had this kind of self-righteous sense that there are seekers of the truth, and I don't think it's an accident that lots of people got the idea that that's what you were saying. Although people should read it for themselves.
Right. Well, maybe people got that because they misread it. Maybe to some extent there's a groupthink echo chamber effect on the left that caused people to use it, which is also a handy kind of straw man cudgel to beat back the parts of the argument that they didn't like.
Yeah. Let me give you an example that's from the piece itself. And by the way, I should warn you, I'm supposed to do some conference call, and if they call like this minute, I'll ask them to hold off for a few minutes, but I will have to go in a while. Before I do that, I'll give you the last word, I swear. I do want to say There's an example in your piece where I think having a kind of unconscious agenda, the way we all do, influences the analytical quality of the piece. And this is what I mean. There's this piece where you bring in Coase of Daily Coase, and you kind of you do this like insult thing where you say he's comically out of his depth philosophically or something like that. Maybe it's not that extreme, but you know what I mean, right?
Right.
And you bring up this example where you say a well-known example is he defines libertarian Democrats and then goes on to define what is in fact just a classic liberal. And you leave it there, and it's this kind of seemingly affected insult. And I had the impression that he didn't even know what a libertarian was. You didn't quite say that. I had that impression. So I went back and looked at what he wrote. Mm-hmm. He clearly did know what a libertarian was. And what's interesting is that I thought you could have used this example in a way that spoke more to the analytical part of your argument, maybe in a way that benefited it, actually. But the interesting thing to me about that was he knew damn well the word libertarian is not traditionally used like that. He was saying, look, a libertarian Democrat is concerned not just about freedom from government intrusion, but the freedom to know that you have good health care and stuff like that.
Right.
So he was actually getting at, whether he knew it or not,
freedom to make a living without being unduly exploited by employers,
right,
etc. Yeah.
It actually, I don't know if he knew this, but it got to Isaiah Berlin's distinction between negative freedoms and positive freedoms. So it was
right.
It was not a trivial point he was making philosophically. Now, you're right that he was, I think, kind of self-consciously wanting to redefine liberalism as this libertarian democratic stuff. But what he was doing, it seemed to me you could have used it as an example of him doing mere framing, which is what you attribute to these people, and they are in the framing business to a large extent. Doing mere framing in the guise of substantive analysis, right? In other words, what he was saying was liberals should seize the freedom meme. Don't let the right have the freedom meme. And
right.
that would have been, to me, that would have been more interesting than the personal insult that you used it for.
I don't think that's the case. In fact, I know people who have had interactions with him. I don't want to go into any more detail, but I have a lot of reasons to think that lack of depth was behind that, and his inability to defend that thesis effectively was. But another piece of evidence.
Although one thing that was clear from his posting was he did know that the word libertarian had not traditionally been applied this way. He knew it was a novel application. You may be right that he thought he was inventing a new substantive category when what he was engaged in was relabeling. But you see, that's the part that I'm saying really spoke to the heart of your piece.
It seems not to have occurred to him that libertarians have considered the possibility of positive versus negative freedom and come to a different conclusion than liberals, social democrats have.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very, very old philosophical break, right? There's a point a long time ago where the two branches of the tree just go in different directions, right? The people who are libertarian on economic issues versus people who are not libertarian on what freedom means. And I don't think he knew about that at all.
Yeah.
I have a lot of reason to think he didn't know about that at all. And that's why I use that to support the point of him being out of his depth philosophically. And lots of people, including people who are sympathetic to him, believe as well that he's out of his depth philosophically. And some of them cite that example as to support that position.
Okay, well, I would just, after all this, I would just state at least a moderate version of my critique of your piece is saying that, and I think Matt Iglesias actually said something like this on Blogging Heads to Dan Dresner discussing your piece, is that there's much more in the way of a continuum of motivation among all the people you describe and that you tend to describe in dichotomous terms. And I would add to that, often the motivation is entirely unconscious, and to the extent that there's dishonesty, which I think pervades human thought and discourse, in a certain sense, it tends to be unconscious. And that's kind of the main point I'm making. But since these people may call at any moment, I should give you a last opportunity to say anything, including gratuitous insults of me.
I agree that there's a continuum. I don't anywhere say that there's not a continuum. What I think is striking is that there's a movement of people that explicitly rejects what you and I agree on as a kind of value system and what used to be the predominant value system. So to say that some people, you can fall short of it even if this is your goal, I agree. But that, to me, that it's important and noteworthy that they don't just also fall short of it. And that they don't just sometimes fall prey to it subconsciously as opposed to consciously, but that they have an ideology that celebrates breaking away from this old ethos. That's it.
It's so hard to tell someone that they're going to get the last word, because then whatever you feel like saying after they say the last word, you're not allowed to say.
Why don't you blog it?
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on other matters? I mean, these people haven't called yet. You could talk about college football. Sorry to hear about Bo Schembechler and Gerald Ford. Coming in the same year, that was quite a...
It was.
A blow to Michigan.
More Bo. I didn't care much about Gerald Ford, but yeah, if you grew up a Michigan football fan, Bo was a real presence in your life, almost like someone you knew. It really was. I'm the most unsentimental person I know. I never get upset about public tragedies, but I was really upset when Bo died. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's interesting to anybody.
That's kind of interesting to me, because insight into character. And is it your view, by the way, that that Michigan State football players are propagandists and Michigan football players pursue the truth?
No.
It's not?
No.
I would have thought that.
But it is my view that Michigan State football has been on probation twice in the past 30 years. Michigan football has.
That is so good. I'll bet there's some damning fact about Michigan out there that didn't leap to your mind as quickly, and that's my only point.
All right.
And I will dig it up, and I will hound you with it.
I'm sure you will, Bob.
Okay. Nice talking to you, John. Thanks for taking the time.
Bob. Okay, you too.
See you around.
All right.